Thanks for joining us once again as we continue our look at the Cold War. And whereas, for most of the Cold War, there was no actual fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War does kind of turn hot in what becomes known as the Korean War, sometimes nicknamed the Forgotten War, as it's kind of nestled between World War II and Vietnam. But what we notice is that after World War II, North Korea is divided into basically halves, with Kim Il Sung kind of leading the communist North Korea, and Syngman Rhee the democratic side of South Korea. And what's eventually going to happen is that North Korea will look to invade South Korea, triggering the Korean War as they're looking to unite the two countries. Now, North Korea basically strikes without warning in June of 1950 and quickly passes what's known as the 38th parallel, kind of that dividing line between North and South Korea. And Seoul, the capital of South Korea, falls quickly as the North Koreans kind of continue further south and east down towards the city of Busan. And with those communist advances, Truman calls in Douglas MacArthur and NATO to lead the defense of South Korea. And in September of 1950, MacArthur kind of organizes this counterattack where NATO forces will lead kind of a charge out of Busan and also an invasion into Incheon, a port city on the west coast. And this is actually the largest kind of amphibious attack since D-Day. And NATO forces under MacArthur's command have kind of a lot of success rather quickly, and they are able to push the North Korean forces back across the 30th parallel and advance close to the Yalu River, which is the border of China. Now, as we got close to the Yalu River, the Chinese had actually warned us, of which we didn't pay attention to, that if we got too close, that they would join in on the fighting. And so in November of 1950, the Chinese launch a counterattack across the river, driving the NATO forces once again south of the 30th parallel, kind of capturing Seoul once again. Now, eventually what happens is that, these battle lines kind of fluctuate early on and then settle in kind of right around that 30th parallel for the duration of the war. But MacArthur, at this point, then recommends to Truman that we actually open a second front in China and start to drop our atomic bombs, 20, 30, 40 of them throughout China to try to, not just win the Korean War, but also kind of knock the communist Chinese, out of power. Now, this is something Truman's not willing to do, and he actually relieves MacArthur of his duties because MacArthur was kind of speaking out against Truman. And therefore, MacArthur comes back to the United States for really the first time since the end of World War II, and he was a national hero. Not only had he, helped win the war in the Pacific and defeat the Japanese, but he had helped rebuild Japan after the war, and then obviously, successfully, defended South Korea from communist aggressions. So he was welcomed back, as a hero for what he had accomplished. But as the war had settled into kind of that stalemate along the 30th parallel, it ends shortly after Eisenhower is elected in the 1952 election. He ran as a Republican against a Democrat, Adlai Stevenson. Now, this is that same Eisenhower of D-Day that helped win the war in Europe. And he goes, he kind of campaigns on the idea of ending the war in Korea and defeating communism. And so he does go to Korea and kind of visit the lines and troops there. And by July of 1953, he does fulfill his campaign promise and signs an armistice ending the conflict in Korea. But really, in the end, the most significant result of the Korean War was that it brought about massive American rearmament. We were spending more and more money on defense to try to contain communism and keep it from spreading. And eventually, when Eisenhower was kind of leaving the presidency, he kind of warns about this military-industrial complex and how much money the U.S. was spending on military. But in reality, the Korean War did end, and communism had been contained, and really the border was what it was even before the fighting began. In other Cold War affairs, we witnessed the launching of Sputnik in 1957. And what this was the Soviet Union launching the first satellite to outer space. And so they're kind of winning that space race. Really, this satellite, which was kind of the size of a beach ball, you can kind of see was circling the Earth at about 18,000 miles per hour. And as it kind of crossed the sky, a beeping sound could be picked up on the radios as it passed overhead. And really what it did was kind of create this fear that the Soviets had, created something that would allow them to, get these intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, where they could launch a missile from the Soviet Union and have it rain down upon the United States, which created a great fear inside the U.S., as we thought we were kind of falling behind them. And one of the side effects is that Congress really kind of increases its educational spending, especially in the areas of like math and sciences, to try to help catch the United States up to what the Soviets had already accomplished. And shortly after Sputnik, Nikita Khrushchev, who had succeeded Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union, warned the U.S. that he would crush us and bury us, thus obviously kind of heightening tensions even more. But we'll take a look at other conflicts between Khrushchev and the United States in future lessons. But one of the things during this time in Eisenhower's administration that Khrushchev did have to deal with was the U-2 spy plane being shot down, one which was being commanded or flown by Colonel Francis Gary Powers. And the U.S. had been flying spy missions at high altitudes over the Soviet Union for a number of years by this point, and it had given us a lot of intelligence and information. But by 1960, the Soviet Union had developed a missile that could actually reach up high enough to shoot those planes out of the air, and this U-2 was shot out of the air in May of 1960. Now, eventually, Powers was put on trial for espionage, of which Eisenhower at first, denied that it was, he was spying and that he just kind of flew off course accidentally and was on some other mission. But eventually, as it played out, he was found guilty of espionage and sentenced to prison. However, after a while, kind of several, spies were kind of exchanged for each other, and Powers made it back to the United States. But with that said, you can kind of see the beginning of the Cold War and how our fears of the spread of communism really shaped our, kind of foreign and domestic policies and increased our spending on national defense. And we took an idea of containment where we wanted to contain communism, and under Eisenhower's administration, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had kind of developed this new policy of massive retaliation in 1954. And under the idea of massive retaliation, we were kind of saying that we would use anything at our disposal or any measure necessary to keep the United States' interests safe around the world, including the use of atomic bombs. So throughout this time, that fear of war and communism fueled the Cold War. But it doesn't end in the 50s. The Cold War continues for another several decades and really doesn't end until the fall of communism in the 1990s. But we'll be taking a look at kind of life in the 50s, post-World War II, in our next episode.